Welcome back to the Corner of Story and Game, the podcast where we explore the interesting intersection between storycraft and game design. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Joe Morrissey to the table. Joe is an industry veteran whose impressive career spans over 2 decades in game development, with roles at iconic studios such as Rockstar Games, Blizzard, Sucker Punch, and the Believer Company. Known for his expertise in crafting immersive narratives, Joe has helped shape some of the most compelling story-driven experiences in gaming. Today we're going to dive into the importance of choosing the right narrative channel when telling stories in digital games and other places. So let's get into it. Joe, thanks for joining me.
Hey, I'm glad to be here, man. Really glad.
I'm excited to sit down and chat with you today about narrative channels, putting stories where they're supposed to be, where they work the best. But before we dig into the topic of the day, I like to lay the foundation with your origin story. How did you fall in love with gaming, telling stories in general? What was your career journey like, highlights along the way, and where are you today? What's happening these days that you can talk about?
Yeah, totally. That sounds great. Origin story is a good example for me. I do often kind of see it like that. I've always loved stories. I've always loved telling stories. By the comic books behind me, obviously it's apparent that I like to read them a lot. As a kid, I had a dream to become a comic book writer. I just thought it would be like the coolest job in the world to have. And I went to college for language arts and creative writing as well. And the comic book thing wasn't really happening. Like I had a couple things that kind of came out of it that I did, but I went away to college and had to kind of be an adult as I told myself of kind of what was going on. And the idea of like working in games or being a storyteller in games was not really a thing. Like this is like mid-90s sort of stuff, right? So it was like, yeah, there were video games. We played video games a lot, but the idea it's like, oh, hey, yeah, if you don't know how to program, you can work in video games. I was like, yeah, I wasn't really thinking about it. I did, however, in order to kind of pay off some debt for college, because I was worried like that was starting to come due, I got a job as like an IT desktop support person, right? And it was fine. I thought it was great. I actually was like, hey, this is a cool career. It pays pretty well, and I can still like do stuff, and I like the tech side of it. But the place I was at was shutting down. I needed to find another job. And at the time, my housemates and I were playing like Quake 2 and StarCraft, like LAN parties, like on a regular basis. And I was like, hey, I should see if there's any like game jobs that like need IT support or whatever, right? Again, not even thinking, hey, Joe, like I grew up like writing comic books, writing short stories, running role-playing games, making my own role-playing games, right? Like I was very creatively focused, but like I want to go back in time and kind of slap that version of myself. It's like, look, this is the path, right? But I didn't kind of see it, but I was like, oh, it'd be cool to get a job as an IT guy at a video game company. And I was in the Bay Area at the time. And in San Mateo was Blizzard North. They were working on the Diablo franchise. Mm-hmm. And I applied for them. I ended up getting the job for desktop support. How I got hired and everything is a whole other long story I won't get too much into. But I ended up starting working there as desktop support. And I was across the hall from the guy who was writing all of the quests for Diablo II. And his name was Phil Shank. And he would come by and we would chat and we'd talk about story and we'd talk about quests and we'd talk about that stuff. Still completely like nothing was clicking in my brain at this point, right? I was like, hey, that's cool. I got to fix a bunch of machines. And then he comes by one day and he's like, hey, I'm leaving to go to another company. And I talked to the bosses and said that you should take over doing the quest stuff for the game. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm like, you sure? He's like, yeah. He's like, I think you'd be great at it. And so a day or two later, the boss came in. I was fixing the machine. I remember this very distinctly because he's like, hey, Phil talked to me and he said that, you'd probably be good to do this. And I was like, yeah, I think it'd be cool. He's like, all right, well, you're still going to be doing like all the IT work. Like you're not going to like transition into that. We're not going to pay you anymore for doing the work. You're not going to get royalties or anything like that. Like you just need to just get the story done. And like the one piece of advice that still resonates with me was like, don't get in the way of the gameplay. That was like, and he had some other probably not such nice things to say about story and games and whatnot, but it was very much like, just do your job, get the dialogue written and the quest stuff taken because we already knew what all the quests were at that point. So it was like writing all of the different lines of dialogue and whatnot that needed. And then, which was crazy because it ended up like casting voice actors and going down to recording sessions and like prompting, how do you pronounce Haradra Cube? You know, like those sorts of things and kind of going through that. And that was really kind of interesting. And then that did transition into the Diablo 2 expansion was like the first time where I really was like, taking a swing and going, okay, here's the 6 quests that I think we should do. Here's the rewards that we should give. Here's kind of the characters and the dialogue. And I was really nervous because they have this whole like review process where it was like 20 people in a conference room reading over my like 6-page breakdown of what was there. And I was like, I've never done this before. I was already getting feedback from people that was like, why is the IT guy trying to pitch like what our story is? And then there was a guy and there a programmer named Peter who's like, you know, he ended up being my office mate for a number of years, but he was brilliant. Like just stuff he was doing with Diablo and what he was bringing along was like anything if he said it was good, right? And he was like, I love this quest. I think this is like he really promoted it, and that was kind of like at that point everyone was like, oh, I guess this is what Joe does now, right? So sort of a stuff and kind of going through that space. And that's been, and you know, and I eventually obviously transitioned out of IT much later than I needed to. I think change is a problem for me. And then started, you know, I was at Blizzard for, you know, 6.5 years. And then from there, I worked at some other studios, ended up going on to City of Heroes about partway through the development as the mission designer on the project for quite a while there. I really loved the team and kind of building out your own IP. Like you weren't doing as much as I probably wanted to work on like a Marvel game or something like that. Like being able to create your own heroes and do what you want with them actually had a lot of draw, right? Um, and then yeah, as is the case, that studio shut down as well. And this is like 2012, and ended up getting an offer to come to Washington State to work on the infamous games at Sucker Punch. And again, love comic books. I was already working on a superhero game. And so it was great to be, I'm like, yeah, this is like, I love the infamous games. Like this, I'll totally work. And it was the third one they were working on, Infamous Second Son at the time. Came on partway through that, helped out. The job there, it's like, was less writing and more designing, right? That was kind of where the transition was really starting to come for me of like, all right, there's some storytelling involved, but really it's about building gameplay for open world mechanics and how does this help kind of sell the world that you're trying to do. And I had written a bunch of side quests for that game that we just weren't able to, we just cut all of them. Like we weren't able to execute in any of that stuff with the time that we had. But then, yeah, then that led into Infamous First Light, which was like a standalone DLC that we had. And that was, again, like all of the bosses kind of went to go figure out what the next thing was going to be after the Infamous franchise. And so they kind of left the rest of us to be like, okay, you guys understand how this works, kind of go. And so I really got to kind of, again, step into a role and kind of really like take a lot of that and kind of see it come to life, and had a lot of fun doing that game. And it was great because it was like so tight and so clean on what we were delivering. And at a lot of levels, like I like it more than Second Son because of like how distilled that game is. It's like, yeah, it's a blast to play. And then yeah, the most recent one for me that came out was, we spent a while to find it, but eventually bringing about Ghost of Tsushima as kind of the big like PS5, PS4 title that we had. And I was on that project all the way through the development of where we were just a handful of designers at the time, and I was like the only kind of like mission narrative designer, and we were rebuilding tools, so it was a lot of tools work in that respect, but really kind of seeing it come to life, and all the kind of the good and the bad of like throwing yourself into this world and emotionally getting connected to like samurai culture and Mongols and kind of how things went and everything, and kind of building that stuff out. But that's been like, that was really great. Game came out during COVID, which was super awkward. To kind of, the celebration was kind of an odd one, you know, through Zoom sort of thing. But, and then, yeah, it was kind of, at that point, I felt like it was time for me to find like a new kind of story to tell. The trying to be in the ghost story, like talk about like it can be kind of emotionally wearing to kind of live in that space for a while. And I was like, I think I need something like a little more upbeat, a little more optimistic. Um, and went over to probably Monsters from that for about 2 or 3 years to work on a project that sadly never came out. The studio got shut down. It was a great team, great idea. I still love it. It's one of the ones that I think I was the most like personally connected to and invested in. And at that point, I was a game director, so I kind of moved, the journey from IT desktop to to game director in only 25 years. But and now I'm over at Believer, where I'm game director here as well. And we have a lot of cool ideas. It's an open world like space fantasy cooperative game that we're looking at building out, and that's like really exciting and very terrifying to try and kind of wrangle all of that together. But it's fun, man. I wouldn't trade it for the world. It's crazy that like I kind of backed into this pace that was kind of an obvious one in hindsight. Like all of my friends are like, well, yeah, we knew you were going to end up someplace like this, even if you didn't, right? Like kind of in that area.
That is one hell of a journey, man. That is cool. Looking back, you mentioned at the beginning, tabletop. Yeah. I always kind of I like when I talk to digital designers and narrative designers, I like to talk about, because quite often you'll find there's a tie to that tabletop. So before we move on to the main topic of the day, I'm just curious, when you were playing tabletop back in the day, were you the DM or GM? Were you the guy running the games?
Always, yeah.
And were in that case, were you running Homebrew World or were you running pre-built?
Yeah, so exactly. It was all homebrew. There was a game back in the 80s called like Marvel Superheroes by TSR.
Yep.
And I picked it up at like a Walden Books or something like that. It was like an old box thing. And I started to read through it. It was kind of confusing. I played a little bit of D&D with some friends of mine, so I kind of understood the concept, and we played relatively free frequently. I never found D&D that compelling for me at the time, right? I was a comic book nerd, and I was like, I don't like all this fantasy stuff. But what I did like about the Marvel superheroes thing is they had two things that were awesome. They had on the back of their book, they had this like Excel sheet grid that was like your percentile roll chart. So it was like, hey, from 0 to 100, and then they had these ranks that were all like comic book Marvel. It's like, oh, my strength isn't 15, it's remarkable, right? And it's like, and then there's incredible, and then there's amazing, and there's spectacular, like all of the kind of going through all of those. And so depending on whatever your abilities were in fighting, agility, strength, endurance, reason, intuition, or psyche, right, kind of going through that FASRIP, that's how we would always remember it, you would end up like going, oh, well, I have a spectacular strength. So you roll on your percentiles and it'd be either like white for you miss, or, yellow for, hey, a partial success, green for like hey, really good, or like a red result was always the one of like, oh, I got like 98 to 100 or something like that. And essentially I ignored everything else in the Marvel book, but like the character sheet and that diagram. And then they had another supplement they put out called the Ultimate Powers book, which was just like, it's a great resource of like every superpower you could ever kind of think of at the time attached to like percentile die rolls sort of stuff. So you roll up your abilities and kind of going through all that stuff. And that was it. And I ran that for years, and until I discovered Cyberpunk. And then I ran Cyberpunk for probably about 13 years or whatever. And then World of Darkness, and I ran that for a long time. And so it was very much like kind of going through these scenarios. But yeah, I was generally the GM in all of them. And I would just, we play around. I think one of my favorites though was there's another Artellisaurian series called Dream Park that wasn't quite as popular, but I love the idea of it. It's based off of these two Larry Niven, I think it's two Larry Niven books, where Dream Park is essentially like a Disneyland meets like a hologram, like a holodeck kind of experience, where it's kind of meta too. You have to like be a role player to kind of keep up, where you're like, hey, you're playing a character. It's like, hey, I'm Bob the janitor, and I want a ticket to go to Dream Park. And when I go to Dream Park, there's a bunch of games I can go on, and it might be like the zombie pirate game is one of them. And it's like, but in that game, I'm going to play Blackbeard, this character. So you're like a character playing a character. And so you would play a bunch of different games every time you'd play, but you might always still be like Bob the janitor, but you would be like you could take on a wide because it was a like a meta genre game where it'd be like, hey, this is zombies meets pirates, or this is space opera meets true crime, and you would like mix these together and you would play them. And I ran that, and it was just a D6. That was the thing I liked about it. It was very much like, and we would play it. I used to hang out, total like 80s kid. We used to hang out. A friend of ours worked at a gas station, and we'd hang out like in the bay of the gas station with like a 4x8 sheet of plywood on the lift, and we would just game till like 4 in the morning until the boss was going to show up, and then we'd have to clear out and kind of go through that. But yeah, so that was very much so. And I think I tell anybody who's like, hey, I want any games, or my kid wants to get into games, I'm like, all right, they should run like a fifth edition game with their friends, and if they can keep those kids interested for like a year, they probably can do game development kind of. And it's like like get your 10,000 hours in, so sort of thing.
Yeah, agreed. It's a very common thread. Do you still play today? Do you have a game on
I
the
don't
go?
actually. Like both of my kids play, and we talk a lot about kind of gaming in that. And I've been roped into a couple like birthday party things where it's like I'll run for
Well, that's
the
cool.
kids or whatever, and that's nice. But I still buy a lot of the books that I don't need. I like to read them and everything like that. But yeah, I noticed this probably as early as back when I was at Blizzard. I saw that because I was running games at Blizzard. Had like a champion, not champions of Palladium. It was one of the superhero games at the time. I was running one of that, and I just noticed that I was like, my interest was decreasing more and more as my interest in how you tell stories in games kind of picks up. And so it very much became like I needed a creative outlet. It was tabletop. And then when I started finding this creative outlet in games, I'm like, yeah, now like I don't really game as much. And I kind of regret it, but it's like life, family, finding time, all this other
Yeah.
stuff like that. So it's kind of there for it. And now I'm like, I don't even know if I'd know how to do it if I jumped in. It'd be crazy.
I'm fairly certain you would fall right back into it, man. Only one way to find out.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's dive into the matter of the day, the topic that we're here to discuss, and that is narrative channels. So set the stage for me. How do you define narrative channels in the context of digital games, and why are they crucial? Why are they important?
Yeah, like so narrative channels, and there's probably been a bunch of different words. I used to call them narrative tools. Started calling them narrative channels a little while ago. It's relatively like a common thing that anyone kind of has when you want to tell a story, but essentially it's a method by which you tell a story in a game, right? And these things are like I have cutscenes, or I have audio logs, or I have like overheard conversations, or a web comic that I do, right? Each one of those is a channel that you bring about in your game. And the trick, right, is like, every game's going to have, half a dozen or more of these channels, but you really want to make sure like which channels work best for your game, right? You want to try and figure out what that is. And then really you want to also figure out like how do you make that channel your own for your game, right? Like how do you theme it so it works in kind of the way that you want?
So how do you go? How do you go about choosing the most appropriate one? I guess is where I would naturally start to wander here.
Yeah, there's a couple like it's interesting to me because I think it's easy to do the easy thing, right? It's easy to kind of do the like, all right, well, I'm making an open world action adventure RPG, therefore I'm going to need to have a main character who has a storyline, so that's likely going to call for cutscenes, that's likely going to call for a different type of overheard VO, and you kind of go through kind of that route. But I think you kind of want to first take a step back and kind of go, okay, what are the emotions you want people to feel when you're playing this game? Because each channel kind of has an opportunity to bring that emotion closer to the surface, right? Like if we watch like a cutscene from Naughty Dog, like that has a lot more potential to get a grown man to cry, right? Than like a book that you might find in the game that has like 20 pages about kind of what's going on, right? That might still do it, but
Mhm.
like the chance to bring emotion full forward, or the type of emotion, is a lot less. So in any given moment, you have to kind of figure out like, hey, how do you want, what is it you want the player to feel when this comes across? And then the other thing I look at a lot is like, when, like, in the history of the game, like the timeline of this game, does this experience take place, right? So if this is a if you have this really deep rich world and you want to kind of express some of the history of that world, probably not best to have like some NPC in town that you go talk to, and he has this like dialogue cutscene thing that you're kind of going through, that he's explaining like, in 1600 this is what we blah blah blah. It's like, no, it's probably better expressed where it's like, hey, you turn that corner and there's this old cathedral that looks like it's been there for a few hundred years,
Mm.
and it's seen some shit, right? And you're like, okay, like I'm now getting a channel, and environmental storytelling, I think, is one of the strongest channels that you have at your disposal in this kind of stuff, because of the medium that we're in. But yeah, it is very much like, hey, do you want to have depth of your world? Do you want to bring in intimacy across? Do you want to bring like a sense of urgency? And then from that, you can kind of start to pull out like which channels work best.
That makes sense. You mentioned cutscenes,
Yeah,
cinematics. You'll hear often designers talk about how they take away player agency, how a player has to stop playing to watch it.
yeah,
But then when you mention emotional beats, my brain goes back to when Arthas in Warcraft, when he kills his father, and long time for spoilers, so
yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
That wouldn't have had the same impact if you had come into the throne room and found you dead laying and like environmental storytelling, or found a log that explained what happened. Like, you had to see that happen. I remember the gut punch as a kid playing that. Like, that had to be
Yeah.
that way, right? Or could it have been done a
Well,
different
I
way?
think so. So yes, I think because of the emotional feel you wanted to bring, there's an example that I have, that I talk about with this, that I think is unique to games, which is the end of, the spoiler here for this, but the end of Last of Us 2, right? Which is relatively more recently. So,
Mm-hmm.
Ed, if you don't want to know how that works.
It's still long enough.
But I played through Last of Us 2, I played through Last of Us 1, I played through 2, and then you get to this end scene where you have your final fight with Abby, and where the story has gotten you to that point, you're done. You don't want to fight Abby. This is dumb. Like the revenge cycle, you're like, no, I'm exhausted. This is not working. But she decides she's going to fight Abby, right? And because of that, you have to fight it. Where it's like, they could have easily have done the Arthas route, where they show a cutscene where the two of them fight, and you're
Yeah.
like, no, what is she doing? I think this is a bad idea. But you watch the whole thing, right? But they didn't. They made you fight Abby, right? And that's that's the like the magic of the game, that a movie can't do, that a book can't do, that a role playing game can do, right? But you like, being able to kind of see it on that cinematic level, it kind of really brings it out. And I hated it, right? Like, I was pissed, right? I put the controller down. Can I just lose this scenario? And I wasn't the only one. I talked to a bunch of people, and I was kind of like that. And for a long time, probably years, I was like, man, fuck that game, right? And then I was like, man, I'm hanging on. It's living rent free in my head way
Right.
longer than it should for something. And that's where it kind of was like, kind of a slow dawn for me. But I was like, yeah, that's fucking brilliant, man. Like, like they made me do that. Like, they brought that emotion directly to me. And I didn't, again, it's interesting because you talk about a sense of agency that gets lost in the cutscene.
Mm-hmm.
But on that point, it also removes any accountability for you in the narrative. Whereas playing Ellie that whole time and shooting all those people and killing all those people, I was totally fine with that. It was totally great, right? I was doing it for Joel. Everything was good, right? And but then, like, to get to that last scene, and it's like, no, you can't get off the train yet. Like, you've got to play this all the way through. And I was like, yeah. And I know there was like, that ending was very controversial for a lot of people, and I still have debates with people about it, because I was exactly there. And then I was like, yeah, like, that's, and I don't know if I just admire the skillfulness or the craftsmanship of what they had us do more than I how it made me feel, right, in that respect.
Hmm.
But I think that's a good example. So like with the Arthas example, like if you had gone in and you were playing the person who killed, like you do a person, a POV switch and you have to play that person, or
Yeah.
you're playing the person who gets killed, in that respect, probably would have had a much greater impact than walking in and then seeing that cutscene kind of play out. The cutscene's amazing. Blizzard does amazing cutscenes, right? But it's like
Yeah.
kind of going through that.
That makes sense. What about timing? What effect does choosing a channel have on timing? Like environmental storytelling in my mind allows you to slow things down and soak it up, but are there ways to speed up timing and increase pacing and stuff like that
Yeah,
using
it's
channels?
interesting. One of the hardest things in mission development is to trick, and we all, both the player and developer, know it's a lie, but we all want to believe that it's not, which is like the sense of urgency that your mission has, right? Oh, please, if you don't go right now, my daughter's going to drown in the well. And you're like, yeah, I'm going to go collect some stuff. I'll be back, right?
Pick up a side quest on the
Yeah,
way.
exactly. And some games will actually legitimately be like, yeah, no, this is a time mission, but then we put a clock on it, right? Playing Witcher 3, I had that kind of, they didn't have a clock, but I was just like riding my horse by and there was some house on fire and one was like, please, you got to help me. And I was like, hey, I'm dealing with something. And then it said like mission failed. And I was like, wait, hold on. Like that's not fair. And it's like, yeah, no, but it's accurate. Right.
Yeah.
Kind of in that respect. But getting that sense of urgency is always a trick, because if you push it too far, it breaks the fourth wall for the player, because they're like, yeah, I know it's not urgent, but I'm agreeing that the character that I'm playing believes it's urgent, and I'll get to it. I probably, like kind of that sort of sense. And so, you can do things with one of the things I call like overheard dialogue, so sort of stuff where it's like, hey, the different NPCs are talking. You get what I call like active scenes as opposed to like cut scenes, where it's like, hey, they're all running towards the burning house. The music picks up. You get the environmental storytelling of the fire, right? And the hope is that we like sweep you up in the moment, that you kind of ignore the fact that you're like, oh yeah, actually I could probably go do 20 hours of content and this house would still be on fire and those people would still be standing around it kind of doing the thing. But you're also like, but maybe not, right? Like maybe it is like The Witcher, and if I don't do this right now, then that's it, right? And that's always kind of the trade-off. So I think there are things with narrative channels, but again, like when I talk about, hey, you want to pick when this takes place. Like, is this the part of your story? Is like, is this the thing about your past of the world? Is it a thing about the present that you want to do? And then pick ones that are like, well, if it's active, it's a thing that's there. Then you want to have NPCs that have the VO for it. You want to have like these active scenes, or if you are going to do cut scenes, like you want to kind of bring that forward. You don't want to have a web comic about a thing that's like, all right, you've got to go solve it. And you're like, wait, what? Like that doesn't make any sense in that respect.
Right. Okay, so that establishes what narrative channels are. Do you have some examples of like ones that are really good that stand out in your mind that we could kind of hold up as an example of here's where the narrative channel in this game was perfectly chosen? I mean, you've hit on a couple and we've
Yeah,
highlighted a
yeah.
couple.
Yeah, I think The Last of Us is a probably like
The
master
best.
class of kind of how to get somebody into essentially taking the narrative channel being like, well, it was kind of quick time event cutscene because you were in this fight scene. You didn't have a lot of for free freedom, but kind of going through that sort of stuff to kind of get you to like feel like you were playing that. I think another good one is Firewatch does. Well, there's a bunch of great ones, but I think Firewatch, the opening bit for Firewatch,
Okay, yeah.
has a bunch of good stuff in it, because they have like three different kind of narrative channels out of the gate that they do. Like there's these cutscenes that you get that have like simple text that comes up, explains about you and your wife and the relationship you have, interspersed with like him packing up, him getting in the truck to go to like to the Firewatch place, and he like moves through the environment, and then it like cuts back to these moments where you kind of have this kind of space in it. And so you got like the cutscenes that tell the like the distant past of what's going on. So they help add like the foundation of kind of what's going on, but they're not very long, and they're interactive, right? Because you're picking like, do we buy the dog that is the like the German Shepherd, or do we buy like the small little cute dog that she can take to work or whatever, right? Like,
Right.
and you're
Yeah.
kind of making that kind of choice in there, and then that how that plays out kind of gets into that area, right? And then you get the environmental storytelling where um like even in some of the scenes where you kind of see his truck, you see whatever, and you're like, oh, he's got a bag, he throws it in the back, like you can kind of see like, oh, he's going someplace. And then as he's when he actually arrives, there's like the stand for the park ranger stand that has like the map of what's going on, and then all the posters and billboards, and you're just kind of sitting there going like, oh, I'm like in a national park. And I mean, I kind of saw from the artwork and the name, I could kind of get a guess of where it was at, but it's like establishing what that is. And then like by the time he actually gets to the Firewatch stand, right, you've established like why he has left, like the state of his relationship with his wife,
Hmm.
his drinking problem, right? Like how he's high, like you know who this character is, and you also have been like kind of grounded in the world that you're at. And then you bring in, I think it's Delilah. I'm trying to remember the name of the
Sure.
woman that he starts this conversation with, and that becomes the very like active arc of like you quote unquote the hero's journey of like how that character goes through that thing. And so it's like they made the choice of like, okay, there's still environmental storytelling all throughout this relatively static world, right? Like there's not a lot of actual like movement kind of going on in there, but they have a lot of environmental storytelling to kind of give you the context of the world as a whole, like what's happening, what's going on. But it's like recent past sort of stuff. You find like campsites, or like I think you find a dead body at one point, and there's some stuff like that in there. And then the rest of it's all through kind of the dialogue between these two characters. So they don't have like a lot of narrative channels that they do, but they manage to like really milk each of those for like a lot of kind of orders. I think a lot of other games, especially a lot of bigger games, will be like, we're going to have a dozen different narrative channels that are going to, and that's kind of what we did on Ghost. Like we had a bunch of different narrative channels that we used, and different people kind of respond to different ones at different levels based off of where you're at in the game. That's just kind of when you have an opportunity, you kind of can get into that.
Cool. Cool. That example kind of it raises a question in my head that kind of wanders off to the side for a second here, but bear with me. You talk about the beginning of a game, and often you'll hear designers talk about the challenges of onboarding, where you're trying to set the stage, establish the world, start the story, give backstory, but you're also teaching controls or the rules of the game. You're trying to instruct the player how to play. Is that part, what we call a tutorial, is that also consideration when it comes to narrative channels? Like, is it important what narrative channel you choose to teach gameplay mechanics?
Yeah, dude. So I can get kind of I have a bit of soapbox with this one actually.
Right on, have at her.
So I absolutely it is where narrative is a consideration for every aspect of the game, even down to like what combat abilities you decide to give your players, how that brings the theme of the game across, what you're trying to do. Like, you have conversations around like, hey, in this game, do you kill people or do you just web them to the wall when you throw them off the building, right? Like there's everything kind of ties into that space to kind of figure out what's going on. And so when you're figuring out like how do you onboard somebody into your game, there's like the standard, I would say, broken kind of method of like, well, we have this way of talking at the player, so that's how we'll train them, right? Is that we'll have an NPC that's like, go pick up that gun over there and then go do that, and like kind of go through this whole process. And there's only so many like firing ranges you can go through in like an onboarding where you're like, okay, just kind of like this isn't really, and some of them like the hell divers one was great because it really sold the like, yeah, you're gonna get blowed up a lot in this
Yeah.
game, right? This is kind of a thing for it. But at the end of the day, it was still very much kind of in that space. The thing that I push back on a lot in the games that I work on is NPCs that in character try and explain the game, how to play the game to the player, right? Because there's this break of like you're a human who's playing a character, right? And oftentimes we conflate like player character to player kind of in that sort of stuff. But if you have your character in the game who is essentially talking directly to the player, it breaks like it breaks the integrity of that character that you're trying to kind of build in that space. And I think that if you're going to talk to the player about what to play, that's where UI and UX stuff comes in. That's where it's like, all right, just bring a thing up on the screen that explains what's going on. Sure, that guy, he's going to teach you how to fish or whatever, right? And he could have a dialogue that's like, I got an extra fishing pole out back. If you get any fish, you, because this is like the Stardew kind of thing where it's like, you feel free to bring any fish to me and you can do it. But then you like go pick up the pole and you go stand by water and then we go doo doo. And we go like, here's how you do this, right? Like, and explain it. If he's standing there going, you're going to have to draw back on your pole to do this, you're like, yeah, this starts to feel fishy at that point. And so I've always pushed that stuff away in that respect. But I think that we're talking a lot of this now where I'm at right now at Believer, and the thing I try and push on is like, don't think of the opening of your game as the tutorial, right? Think of like the first 75% of your game as the like onboarding process for what you're teaching. It's kind of like a bit of the Nintendo philosophy. If you're like, hey, because I've worked on a game that I was given the first like 6 levels of the game. It was like 20 level action platformer game. And I was given like the first 6 levels to work on. And those were the tutorial, like the first few levels were the tutorial levels. And so I was like, all right, what are all the mechanics of this game? What are all the things we need to teach? Let's go through all of this stuff. And, sadly, those 2 levels were the most difficult levels of the game because I was teaching every mechanic that we would have within those 2 levels, where it's like, hey, that particular like rail grind thing or the chimney climb that you were going to do. And this is what I realized, like in hindsight, I went and looked and I was like, hey, we don't use that again to like level like 9. And you know what? We had to teach it there anyways, because people have forgotten how to do it. And you can't be like, well, I trained them. Like, well, they should know. It's like, no, it's not. It's on you. And so that was like, sadly, we didn't have time to kind of adjust all of it. But it was very much like that was where I learned. I was like, yeah, you train in the moment, right? You onboard in the moment. So think about the opening of your game more as like, what is the experience you want people to come into your world? And then like hold back as much as you can. I call it like taffing out the mechanic, like hold back as much as you can to kind of get to that, because they're going to be overwhelmed with everything that's going on there. Like there's a lot of games I've been playing where like I don't even go into like inventory screens or anything like that until like probably like 8 to 12 hours into like a really complex game. I'm like, nope, I'm going to run around. I'm going to attack things. If I run out of ammo or do whatever. And the idea of like, oh no, you need to learn all of this within the first hour or so. It's like, yeah, I don't actually. Like, I don't really. You just want me to so you can kind of wash your hands of the experience. Be like, well, I trained you. If they didn't figure it out, it's on them. It's like, no. You gotta go along for the ride. So that's kind of my soapbox on that part for it.
Love it. That's brilliant. And I love your example of Helldivers too. That's a good example where they used narrative tools in the tutorial to set tone. Like the tone they set with the dialogue and the instructions there was brilliant. Like
yeah, it definitely made it okay to play yet another firing range example.
Yeah, well done. Well, let's talk for a second. Your love of comic books, static medium as opposed to interactive and immersive medium. Where do narrative channels fall in place? How do you choose them? How do they impact when you're dealing with comic books, novels versus narrative podcasts versus digital games or board games? How does it span outside of just digital games?
So I think, books, comic books, movies, theater, right? Like they all have their own channels that they use from, right? Like, I know I'm probably gonna get the name wrong of the book, but there's like a book like House of Flowers or something like that, or House of Leaves, I think maybe. And like it's one of these few books that like you can't get like a PDF of it because the way the book is put together, it needs to be a physical object that you flip through and kind of look at and kind of go through. And it's like they took I don't know if you ever read like Misery back in the day by Stephen King, right?
Yeah.
Towards he has these 2 narrative channels that he's using. He has the one that is like the 4th person omniscient, or the first bracket, I think it's first person, right, of the author talking about his experience and being in the bed and like all that stuff. And then he has like the actual story that he's writing that is the other part of it. And it's like they've changed the font at this point, and then at some point like the letters start dying like they stop working, and so then like she starts to write in all of the E's by hand, and like you're seeing this like this story unfold on the page. And those are like very like kind of in your face narrative channels, but even doing things where you're how you're choosing to use the POV of your story, or how you're choosing, the Game of Thrones books are great for that, where it's like, hey, we're going to have each character be the channel by which we kind of go through and tell this. And so, yeah, every medium has their kind of own for it. Comic books as well kind of pushes into different spaces as far as visually how, I think like, She-Hulk comics were a great example of that, when like John Byrne was drawing them, because he would like break the fourth wall. She would like
Yeah.
walk through different panels, right? Like all kinds of stuff of just like playing with what that is. Um, there's, I think, the Watchmen series. At the end of each of the issues of Watchmen, there'd be like a dossier report of like the characters that were there, and you could kind of look through and get like a different channel beyond just the one that they were choosing, of kind of what was there. And so all that stuff's there. And the thing that's, for me, that's interesting about the game side of it, and this gets back to that Last of Us example, is that we can let you do the things in the world, right? You could flip through that dossier, you could break through the panel, you could do like, we could really kind of push into those spaces that the other genres don't really allow you to. I think like, again, tabletop kind of is the closest that you can get to kind of live that dream. And there's a lot of things that you can do in RPGs that you're just not going to be able to do in games. No much as how much we call them role-playing games in video games. I've always been like, oh, not really, right? Like have maybe a bit of a tabletop snob, but I'm like, we might get there eventually. But I think those are kind of the things that you can pull forward. And all of the genres borrow from a lot of the other, like there's a lot of the same, a lot of them all have dialogue, right? Kind of going through all of it. So, but there's kind of finding the ones that are more game, like, hey, this, you only could do this in a game, really, is kind of what's there. And that's where it's like the opportunity to kind of have choice and action in what you're doing.
Dude, let's explore the outer boundaries of this concept for half a second here. Tapping into my marketing side, my brain starts going, well, if the physical form of a novel influences the narrative, that's part of the narrative. Is the blurb on the back part of the narrative? Is the dust cover design narrative? And if you take that into digital games, is the marketing team become part of the narrative? Is the pre-buzz campaign you're doing to sell a game before it comes out, is that all part of the narrative?
So I would think so, right? It's very, I've been in the room a few times for games before they were announced, where we've met with like a marketing team in Los Angeles or whatever, right? And they, every single one of them, come from like, what is the story? What is the message? What is the meaning behind what you're doing? And it's funny because sometimes we'll be in the room, we're like, I don't know, it's just kind of a cool game where you punch people. Like we thought of and then they start to talk to you and you're like, oh wait, this is a game about hope and loss. This is a game like, and you like, probably somebody on the team, that's where their headspace was, but like the majority of the team, it's like, it's difficult to kind of dial in for that. But yeah, absolutely, right? Like I'll talk to, when I talk about player fantasy a lot. And one of the questions I'll ask the team is like, okay, imagine our box cover, right? Our hero stands there. They look out across the landscape of our world. In their traditionally right hand, what are they holding? Right? Because if you put a sword in that hand, or a gun in that hand, or a spyglass, or a glowing orb, right? It tells you exactly like what you're gonna get out of that game, right? Kind of that's the, and then you add in like, is it sci-fi, is it fantasy, is it modern, right? Kind of like depending on that. And we're visual in our nature, and it's like you pick up more about the player fantasy from that split second than you do with like any amount of me trying to write a bunch of stuff about what your player fantasy is for that. And so that's where it's like, I'll talk about it. It's like it's the promise we make to the player, and you have to carry that through kind of doing in that. So yeah, I see it as it's all connected. And when you meet, like, I generally see this with like really good art directors are the ones that really understand, because they work in all of those kind of mediums together, and they'll come at you and be like, yeah, our logo needs to be this font because we're trying to tell a story about hope and loss. And I'm like, that doesn't want no anything. And then you look at it and you're like, yeah, you're right. I never thought that, Arial or whatever it would be, right? Would be
Oh, dude, no.
the font for hope, for more for loss, probably. But yeah,
That's Comic Sans.
yeah.
No, there is an art to typography for sure. It's an interesting world. To shift gears for a second,
Yeah.
you mentioned the cover, the guy holding different things, gun versus sword. In my genres, I started thinking, are there narrative channels that are best suited to specific genres, or is that too broad? Is that not a consideration? I guess
It's like I think so. There's, it's all story, right? We've talked about that. To me, I see it as all story. There are, I think, when you talk about like expectations from the audience, kind of is where things kind of come into it. Where, like the new Call of Duty came out recently. I haven't played it, right, but my hunch is there probably isn't like Baldur's Gate 3 level dialogue trees in that game, right?
probably not.
Because the people who bought COD probably have an expectation that that's not what they're buying that game for, right? And so it's like, all right, so that's where it's like that's a narrative channel that you could totally put into the game, but the player expectation and the genre kind of says, hey, no, we expect a lot of like voice comms, to be how you're telling the story.
Yeah.
There's probably going to be some like cool cutscenes in front of every mission. There might be like the dossier planning screen that you're kind of going through. There's definitely going to be like a thing at the beginning where some bad guy blows up a bunch of stuff, and then now you guys all got to go to work, right? Like that's kind of, kind of
Yeah.
those sorts of deals with it, and like an after mission report kind of breakdown. But that's probably going to be the extent of, and I could totally be wrong, and I'm definitely not dissing on Call of Duty. It's one of the freaking biggest games ever, so sort of stuff. But there's an audience that goes, hey, this is what I expect this to be within this genre, and you have to kind of feed to that. Otherwise, you get to this very kind of place where you're like, hey, that wasn't what I was expecting. I think it isn't to say you get route or boring with what you're doing. You just be very aware that if you're like, hey, we want to make this experience like, say they do want to do a flavor of that game, or they're like, yeah, it is going to be shooting, combat, military, all of that stuff, but we actually want you to get really connected and invested to the squad that you're with, right? And you're going to have relationships with them. You're going to deal with their struggles, with their spouses and how their spouses are dealing with stuff. Maybe there's, love interest. There could be drug problems. There could be like PTSD, right? There's all these things that happen in real kind of military, soldier environments that you could bring in a Baldur's Gate 3 style dynamic while you're still going out and doing all of the same sorts of missions. But if you just like lead your Call of Duty 6 game or whatever it is, like with that, without any like set up for people, I think they're going to be very much like, this is not my COD, right? But you could probably do like a side version of that has that. You would just have to, again, talk about the marketing. You have to really sell what that is and be like, yeah, no, this is really trying to hit a different emotional beat than like, yeah, we're America and we have big guns and we like to shoot things, right?
That makes sense. That makes sense. But I am curious because when you talk about expectations, one of the fun things as a writer or creator to do is to play with expectations and to twist them. Is there space out there somewhere for you've got a game where you've laid out expectations, you're playing to the player fantasy, and then you can twist the narrative channels and make something different?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I can think of any examples, but I think
I was trying to.
Yeah, that's the kind of the joy of it, right? Like you you know you have situations where you have to be aware that you're doing it, right? Because it doesn't come for free.
Mm.
One of the things I talk about a lot with designers or students is I call it like proven better new. And when you think about your narrative channels and the genre, like the game genre that you're in, you go, okay, what are the proven narrative channels of an open world game? What are the proven narrative channels of like whatever? And you kind of outline those and you're like, all right, and then these are the ones that we feel like work for our game, right? So you have some like some safe ones, and that should make up, like if you're going to have 10 narrative channels you're going to do, that should probably be more than five, like five or so, because the rest of them get much more expensive because then the next one is like better, right? You're like,
Right.
okay, we're gonna do overheard dialogue or comms channels or whatever, or ping, right? Where you like say a thing when you ping a thing or whatever, just like everyone else does, but we're actually going to raise the bar. We're going to do it better than everyone else does. And so you have to like, that's extra work, that's extra time, that's extra development, prototyping to kind of get that kind of there. And you want to have maybe like two or three of those if you're lucky, right? And then the last one is new. Like what's a narrative channel or what's a game mechanic that like hasn't been done in this genre, and you're bringing it over and you're kind of doing that, and you're like, okay, you only get one, maybe two of those to kind of do. And as long as you're aware that you're doing it and you're not trying to like do everything new, you're not doing like the hard mode of kind of what your game is. It's like a real responsible kind of way to kind of think about what that is and like where you spend your dollars. But yeah, I'd have to think about it. I know there's a bunch of them out there. Observation is a great game that they really had an interesting way of how they told, since you're this like floating ball, like robot ball or whatever it is, but yet the story's being told from like all these other like different characters that are in there or different things that you're happening or whatever. And so it was like, okay, like, yeah, like I always love a game when me, who I've spent a lot of time thinking about narrative channels, I have diagrams trying to map narrative channels, like all of this different stuff, where I'm like, okay, so what is that, an audio log cutscene or like what is that, right? Because that's where I love like pushing into these new spaces where you're like, oh yeah, okay, that is kind of a slightly different narrative channel than what we've seen before, and
Mhm.
it kind of bucks the expectation, but it works within the context of their game. Like that's the real magic of kind of what you're doing, which I mentioned before about like taking a narrative channel like an audio log and going, okay, sure, BioShock had the thing that you walk up and it's a little tape recorder and you click on it, and Control did the same thing with kind of their reel to reel stuff, and both of them
Yeah.
work within the context of their world, but then there's also other examples of like the echoes in Division 2 where it's like it's an audio log, right? Like you walk up, you do some stuff and you hear some VO, there's some visualization to it as well,
Yeah.
and I was playing recently. Suicide Squad kills the Justice League because comic book game, and there's moments where like Lois Lane breaks in to the billboards to give like a report to the people who are still trapped in the city and whatnot. And I'm like, yeah, it's an audio log, kind of what's there in that
Yeah.
place. They have actually actual audio logs that are these like tears in space sort of stuff that you can show up to, and they're very similar to like the echoes as well, where you go there, you do a thing, and then you hear this like previous experience of what was going on in there. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, each of those, like they took the same concept and made it kind of their own to fit with their thing, which is really, that's where you start to like blur, like, well, what am I really watching here? It's not as obvious, which is good, which is exactly what you want.
And some of them, like the dead ghost from Destiny, you actually have to read what you like. You find a dead ghost, you read the logs. So
Yeah, and so that like the way I talk about a lot of this for me is I talk about like as found narrative, right?
hmm.
That's the term that I'll use,
That's
and
good.
there's like a couple different categories. There is like audio, text, visual, right? So if you come around a corner and you see like a billboard or a poster for a thing that's like taught, you're like, oh, I found a visual thing of narrative that in environmental storytelling starts to get into that or whatever. But yeah, and trying to, because there's I put them as different because usually an audio log, when done well, you can like continue to play the game while you're listening to it, right? Some of them, like the Control ones, you have to like stand next to them or listen to them,
Right.
which is a little frustrating when you're like, oh, I just want to keep exploring, but a lot of them you like click it and you can go off and you get like a little, person in your ear, versus the tomes or the scrolls or the Destiny thing where you're like, nope, you've got to kind of like
Yeah.
stop and kind
Yeah.
of read through this.
That makes
Usually isn't
sense.
as well received by players.
So it sounds like most game dev, it's a balance between artistic vision and creative vision and what the team wants to build, and then constraints. What can you do? What
Yeah.
fits best? And I guess apart from all that, are there other pitfalls or oh, are there other pitfalls or challenges that come up that a person needs to be aware of and watch when dealing with narrative channels?
Yeah, there are. I mean, we've talked about one of them, which is the whole like a common pitfall is to get your NPC to teach the player how to play the game,
Mm.
right? Like and it's the thing is like it's ubiquitous, it's all over the place. It's like when I still talk to narrative designers about it, they still look at me like I'm crazy, and I'm like, no, think about what you're doing here, right? Just because every game's done it, it doesn't mean like that's a good way of doing it. Like I think you can get into that. I think another one is which we kind of mentioned above, but it's the idea of like figuring out like, hey, if you need to talk about the state of the world, that what's going on, if the player needs to understand the like political ramifications of a country that they're in or whatever's going on, and it's going to be fairly meaty, probably not best to do the NPC at the beginning that you talk to that's like, we've been at war for 5 years and this group's doing this and this group's doing this and now we're over here. Like, but it's easy. That's the easiest. Like, it's super like once you get, you're like, oh yeah, I can write a bunch of dialogue. I can put this in here and I can be done with it in, a short amount of time. But then the player's like really bored because they got all this stuff they've got to read. They're not making connections to it. You're telling them about stuff that's off scene, that's not even, especially if it's not even in game, right? It's like, oh, 100 years ago we had this fight, and
Yeah.
it's like they just tune out. They just disconnect with it. So instead, you want to kind of so the big pitfall is to kind of not use those easy tools, but to go like, hey, I think I should go to the environment team and be like, hey, we had a war 100 years ago. What does this space look like now? Like, what is the um, like how do the people dress now that they've lost the war, right? Like what is the color palette that we're using? What are the buildings like? And you can get little bits of like overheard dialogue that talk about that. There's much like that. There's an example I give a lot to people when I talk about different narrative channels where I'm like, okay, imagine you are walking down a road and there's a town in the distance, and before you get to the town, you come to the crossroads and there's a tree there, right? And it's because we want this to be narrative. The tree has to have some sort of purpose. We're like, okay, imagine there's like a dead body hanging from the tree, like it was hung there. And then there's like a sign that says like traitor on their neck. So immediately you're like, okay, as a player, environmental storytelling is do a lot of lifting here for us because you're like, okay, there's something going on, probably with the town, right? Because there's this dead body here, traitor, and you're like, okay, does it look like the townspeople did this, or does it look like the government, like the city officials, like hung this guy? Because that's two different narratives
Yeah.
of kind of how that's going to go, right? And then you're like, okay, now imagine like you go up to the body, you do a search, you find like his ring, and it's like in it says like Lucas and Meredith, all my love, or whatever, right? And you're like, oh, there better be a Meredith in that town somewhere that I can go and talk to and find out what the hell's going on in this town, like the political nature of the town, like the strife, the like, because it's obviously not a healthy town if that's what's kind of going on for it. And just that singular moment, like I could come to you and be like, I have this world where it's like this big political strife is going on, like the kings are fighting with each other, they're doing this other stuff. And one way is to like have your Star Wars crawl at the beginning where you're like explaining Fourscore and blah 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 blah. And like another way is to have like some cutscene at the beginning where it's the kings, like you talk about like Arthas and whatnot are kind of debating about this. And all of those are kind of cool if you want to kind of bring this big epicness, but they also like really slow down the kind of the experience versus like, hey, you come across this guy, and I'm not saying you do one over the other, but I think the more you can make it intimate in the moment of kind of what's there and show how like the people that you're standing next to are kind of involved by this. And yeah, you roll into town, people are really quiet, they don't really come up to you, they're closing doors. You eventually track down who this Meredith is and kind of get a sense of it. But the thing I love about that too is like we go from very, very elegantly from like environmental storytelling to like actual potential mission stuff. We can
Hmm.
kind of really kind of go in that space. And we never really asked the player to do it. Like we could put up objective text, but we could also just like, you get the ring and you read the inscription and you could just be like a side thing that you can look into. And the more you can get players to like take those steps on their own, the more they're going to fall into that world for you. Then they're just not chasing one waypoint to the next and kind of going through that.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, the last pitfall, which I've kind of brought in, is like not relying on your environment team as much as possible. Like they want to bring the world to life probably more than you do, right? Like they want to know why every building is where it's at and like the history of all the stuff that's there, and kind of so having those kind of conversations and really kind of helping to sell it, because that's what I mean. That's one of the things we talk about with Elden Ring, right? Like the world that they built out, like I don't understand most of it, but it feels like it's really deep and there's a lot going on. You're like, okay, this is really thought out on kind of what's there. And it's not some guy just explaining to you about this war or that war or why this building was. It's like, no, like you walk around the space and that's kind of what you see in that area.
Gotcha. From a technical consideration point of view, you talk about that example, that brilliant example with the body in the tree. Suddenly that involves bringing in other teams and building out more assets and all these things, as opposed to just finding a note or finding a sign or something.
Yeah.
Is there an actual way for a team, for a company, for a studio to decide this is a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, like this is something that people need to know, this is something people need to experience? Or how do you separate that? Like, how do you make that choice?
It's really tricky. And my bias admittedly is like open world centric, right? Like that's where I've been in for the last 15 years or whatever, is kind of doing open world games. And a lot of times, you have to get okay with them not knowing everything. And so it's actually okay to say the same thing multiple times, right? You just say it in different ways, right? Hey, if this is a town that's under strife and you have this body with the traitor sign, like come up with 5 other ways that you sell that experience, in different parts of the world or in different parts around town or what have you, right? Like, is there a caravan of like soldiers with prisoners, right, that are kind of walking by and they're having conversations about what's going on, or like those sorts of ways, because all of that just adds, it's all world building, right? It just adds to kind of the texture that the player moves in. The arcane games are kind of great with this, right? Kind of really bringing that stuff out. The Dishonored series, where you're just like, yeah, you really feel like the world is a character that you're moving through, and it helps your actions and kind of what you're doing really ground you and kind of make sense in that space. But yeah, like the way, like the tactical stuff that I've done in the past, like very directly, is that we'll have an area of the world, like a region or a zone, and we'll say like, okay, here's the theme, here's what we're trying to talk about in this space. And we'll either, me or a bunch of us, will generate like what are the environmental storytelling like moments, like, and come up with 20 of them or 30 of them, whatever. We'll kind of look at ones, and some will rise to the top and we'll be like, okay, yeah, these actually are really good. So these 5 or 10, that'll get broken out into Jira tasks or whatever it is. An environment team will start to work on it. You might block in like a first example yourself if it's depending on where you're at with that. And then there's just where else you can find it. And I think the real kind of joy is when like the everyone on the team, especially the environment team, kind of gets what you're putting down, right? And they go like, oh, hey, I thought it'd be cool if we had like this thing over here, because you can't do it all yourself, right? Especially on these big games, you need to really get people to kind of understand that.
That sounds like a blast, man. That sounds incredible.
It is, man. It's a lot of fun. I recommend we all do it. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's bring this part of the conversation kind of to a close here. I guess to bring it to a close, what would be the key takeaway you would have for people working in this space when balancing and selecting the right narrative channel for what they're doing?
Yeah, I think the trickiest part, right, there's by my count, there's like 40 different narrative channels at least, right? Like there's a bunch of ones, especially when you get outside of game to like meta level thing, podcasts and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
You have a bunch of them. But the reality is that most games only use like less than a dozen, if not more, and they're almost all the same ones. Like it's like, hey, I have a cutscene, I have some overheard dialogue, I have some UI, kind of stuff like that, kind of do it. Yeah. And so really the big thing is to like make that your own. Like you have to figure out what is the theme of your game, what is the genre, like all this stuff, and go, what is our version of like an audio log? And that's really where I think like magic starts to show up. And I've done this on a bunch of games where I'm like, all right, I need to make an audio log. And it's like, all right, well, this is a fantasy game that takes place in the future and it does all this and like ran by Martian, like whatever it is. And you're like, all right, well, what would be their version? Is it a crystal that like floats around? Is it, kind of, and once you do that, then you start to see your life kind of like the life of the game starts to kind of really come alive and kind of in that stuff. So that's like the big one to kind of like my big thing. Because it's all about telling stories and kind of getting into that space.
I love that. You've given me some ideas for something I'm working on now.
Nice. Yeah, it's fun, man. It's a lot of fun.
All right. Well, that is Narrative Channels. I do have some questions I'd like to ask everybody if you got a few more moments to spare. So some quick fire questions just to get to know you a little bit better. What are you reading these days?
I'm reading Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin for the second time. Actually, it's funny because it's a book about game development, but it's fiction. And when I first looked at it on Goodreads, there's like all these rave reviews that I should read this book, and I was like, oh, it's all of my video game friends. It's like, no, none of them were video game. They don't work in the video game industry at all. So it's this weird cross genre thing, but it's really about the relationship between these three game developers and kind of how they kind of move into games. And the thing I love about this book is it really captures the reason why you would make games, right? Like the passion that you would kind of get into that. So there's some other stuff like plot wise and story wise debatable on kind of some things. We're doing it for our book club at work, and already some people are getting spicy in their opinions of it, which is great. But the thing I love about that is that it's very much like, yeah, if I was to teach like a game development class, I would have like that book and like the art of design by Jesse Shell. Like it'd be those two books would be like assigned reading, because one's the brain and the other one's the heart, right? Of kind of those two things. So not to raise the book too much, but yeah, that's what I'm doing right now.
Well, I'm adding it to my Amazon cart right now. So, yeah. What are you playing these days?
I like recently I fell down Satisfactory pretty hard.
Yep.
Not like
way too many hours.
Yeah, I haven't played Factoria. I don't know if I will, but yeah, my kid plays Satisfactory and they just put out the new 1.0, and I was like, I'll give it a shot. And it feels like the Subnautica team made it, which I loved Subnautica.
Yeah,
it's not, but it has that kind of same kind of vibe to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm playing trying to get into Destiny 2. I mentioned Suicide Squad Kills the Justice League.
Yeah.
Going through that. There's a handful of other ones that I'm starting to kind of poke at. I'm always bouncing around though, and it's usually work related. It's usually like I need to play this because I want to know how they're doing this mechanic or this whatever.
And I asked before, but you got no tabletop going on. Do you play board games at all?
Yeah. Actually, I just got Lords of Waterdeep over here to kind of crack open
Nice.
for stuff. There's I play a fair amount of board games. I'm trying to think. Like I always kind of like blank whenever I get to stuff, but there's definitely a lot of I have like Dead of Winter, King of Tokyo, Arkham Horror, Last Night on Earth, like just within eyesight of kind of where I'm at of things. There's a bunch. We usually have a game night with a bunch of us and trying to find a 6-player game that we can all get invested in, because it's a mix of like kind of casual gamers and then like like my wife and I are more crunchy on kind of what we like to play, and so it's kind of interesting.
That explains Lords of Waterdeep then, because it's got some crunch, but it's still easy to get into, and I think it goes to 6 players.
So the expansion scoundrels of Skullport, brings in 6 players. I've played it once or twice a while ago, and it's going to be a test run with my group because I think it might be too crunchy. But but I think if I know it, like if I played a bunch and get it really down, to kind of help them into it. But it's like, oh, this could be good enough that like we could just kind of always bring this one out whenever we kind of game, because I can't do another like What's Your Meme or Cards Against Humanity or like I've been done with that stuff for years. But it's also the like, it's easy, fine, like let's bring it out and kind of go through and do that.
We find Pandemic works really good for our non-gamer friends who just want something that's
Yeah.
a little crunchy but not terrible. Lords of Waterdeep, there's a version on your phone, like on a mobile game, so you can play and just do hours of playing, and you'll
That's a good
memorize the
idea.
rules. Yeah,
All
that's
right.
how.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. I'll do that. That's a good idea.
So the last quick fire question, this is kind of a weird one, and then we're almost done, is if your essence was perfectly distilled down and injected into a game world or perhaps a comic book world, or what would your character be? Like race, class, stereotype, and what world would it be?
Well, I think it would definitely be an open world superhero game. Like that's a pretty safe bet for me. I always still want to make one of those one of these days, like with a kind of stuff. I think that'd be a lot of fun. I think I would probably like I've always had like a love for Spider-Man, right? So some version of like wisecracking, nimble, kind of, whenever I play D&D, I was usually like a rogue,
Nice.
kind of a character or a ranger. I'd kind of fall into that kind of space for stuff. This definitely would be kind of I think where I would and likely human. I've tried to play like I've gotten like elf, half elf sort of stuff in that area, but I generally am pretty boring in that area. So I kind of stick to those common ones.
All right. There's a philosophical question that lives at the heart of my podcast, my social experiment. I ask it of everybody who comes on the show. So bear with me.
All
The
right.
question is, in my opinion, there is a magical space at the intersection of obviously story and game, but also comic book writing, improv, acting, all these things, where we can all just get along. There's a shared language. There's an instant fellowship. If you agree with me, and not everybody does, but if you do, what is the magical thread that holds all that together?
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's gonna sound like this doesn't make sense, but I'll say it anyways, which is I think we've been telling stories before we could tell stories, right? But before we could talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a species, it's our brains are wired for it. We love drama, we love conflict, right? There's a great quote by Dennis O'Neil, who's like a comic book writer. He wrote a bunch of Batman, right? He wrote a whole. If you like Batman, he's probably him or Frank Miller, right? Like those two guys, right?
Yeah.
And he has this whole thing about telling him a story, and he says like, "Give my demons names and help me confront them," like is one of the lines from that, right? And this is like, and he lists off all of these things about make me laugh, make me cry, do a like, um, and so that's kind of where I see it. It's like we can't not have stories. Like our brain just we to make everything a story, right? If you're trying to hang your clothes up and the hanger breaks, there's a reason, there's a narrative for that, right? Like
Right.
it's just kind of it's how we are. So that's where I'm like I find that part really kind of interesting on how our brains kind of work like that and kind of see it in that respect. And that's where, and it may be completely biased because that's how my brain has worked since I was a child with everything, right? So I just see everything as a story and feel like I'm in a story, feel like all these sorts of things going on, which is why I'll go off too much about my origin stories given the opportunity.
I don't think that's a bias. I think you're bang on because there's books like The Storytelling Animal out there that talk about how story is part of our evolution and how it's a tool that has allowed our species to
Okay.
flourish. So it is definitely a very established theory, and there's lots of people who agree with you. So no
Nice.
bias.
I feel smarter now.
You are smart. All right. We are almost to the end. I do like to open a little space just in case there's something you want to boost. Is there something you're working on or have worked on the past that you want to talk about? Or conversely, where can people find you online to keep track of what you're up to?
Yeah, I mean, I think LinkedIn's probably the best spot that I'm at. I usually stay away from most social media as much as possible nowadays. The if anything to promote, I do have a side hustle. I have a card game called VYE that I've been selling out of the back of my car for a while now. It has a website. We
Cool.
sell through Amazon. We're on our third printing now for it and stuff like that. It's a great, especially coming up to the holidays, I call it a great Thanksgiving Day game because you can sit down with anybody you would sit down with at Thanksgiving and you'll be able to have fun with it. Like it's an easy kind of filler game for those who play a lot of games kind of in that space. But yeah, so it's definitely one of those like I think that's really kind of a good thing for like I like that a game a lot. I've been playing it for years.
Cool.
And it just kind of popped up as it was initially supposed to be a tool that I would use to show that I was a game designer who could make things other than just video games. And we're like, hey, this is cool. We should do a Kickstarter for this. So we did all of that, and now we sell it, and yeah, let's have fun with it.
Well, now I have an excuse to get you back on the show later. We can talk about card game design.
Hey, I'm always down for that. I'm not very good at it, but
Nah.
it's, and that's kind of the scary part about it. Is like, oh wow, it's hard.
I'm willing to bet you learned at least 2 things of value that we could talk about that people would want to know.
Yes, I think that's true.
All right, man. I am going to push you out into the cold, but before you go, I want to give you the last word on the way out the door. Is there any parting words of wisdom, just to life in general?
I think, the main thing I just want to call out, man, is like it is really brutal out there right now in the game industry. Like it's really hard for not just writers, right? Just the industry. Is like just a couple days ago, a place I worked at shut down and let go of a bunch of people. I do have to believe that it will get better, right? That there will, and whether or not it's more belief than fact is, we'll see. But I think that there's a lot of really talented people, a lot of opportunity, and it seems really kind of, like us. I hope it's a safe bet that it's like, yeah, we'll come out of this. But I think that, I'm definitely willing and able. Like if someone wants to reach out to me on LinkedIn, I don't have a job I can give you, right? But from this talk and everything like that, I have a lot of experience in the industry. More than happy to look at resumes. More than happy to like do an introduction if it feels right. So yeah, I just trying to help out as much as I can.
Yes, indeed. It is time to once again close up shop. I'm being told that the portals to the plane of water in the bathhouse have been ripped open, and I need to get down there and close them before that Kraken comes back. But before we go, I want to once again say thank you to Joe for joining us. Your insights on narrative channels and their impact on storytelling has been invaluable. And to you, dear listener, as always, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, keep creating, sharing, and exploring those worlds and stories. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the corner of Story and Game.